Did medieval queens just sit around embroidering and waiting for knights? Did they always obey the Pope? Think again. From the 10th to the 16th centuries, the women on this list stared down the most powerful man in Europe and lived to tell their incredible stories. Get ready to meet 8 queens who rewrote the rules. Number 1. Catherine of Aragon. The year is 1533. King Henry VIII of England has just done the unthinkable. After years of demanding a divorce from his wife, Catherine of Aragon, and being refused by the Pope, he has declared his marriage annulled by an English church court. He has married Anne Boleyn, and the world is holding its breath. For most, this would be a crushing defeat, an end to power, a slide into obscurity. But Catherine of Aragon was not most women, and she certainly was not going to let a king or a pope define her truth. Catherine's life had always been intertwined with power and the church. Born a princess of Spain in 1485, daughter of the formidable Ferdinand and Isabella, she was steeped in a world where piety and political might walked hand in hand. Her parents were the Catholic monarchs who had unified Spain and launched the Spanish Inquisition, but they also asserted tremendous royal authority over the church within their own borders. Catherine was groomed for a future of queenship, a living bridge between Spain and England, destined to marry Arthur, Prince of Wales. Her wedding to Arthur in 1501 was a grand affair, solidifying the Anglo-Spanish alliance. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. Arthur died just months later, leaving Catherine a widow at 16. What was to become of her? Parents and King Henry VII of England quickly devised a solution. She would marry Arthur's younger brother, the future Henry VIII. There was a problem, though. Church law, based on biblical passages, prohibited marrying a brother's widow. A papal dispensation was required. Pope Julius II, known as the Warrior Pope, granted the dispensation without much fuss. The official reason given was that the marriage with Arthur had never been consummated, meaning it wasn't a full marriage in the eyes of God or the Church. Catherine swore this was true, a statement she would stand by for the rest of her life. The young Henry VIII was reportedly keen on the marriage, and in 1509, just weeks after his father's death, he married Catherine. For years, their marriage was a success. Catherine was popular, intelligent, and influential. She bore him children, though tragically. Only one Princess Mary survived infancy. But as the years passed, Henry's obsession with a male heir grew into a consuming fever. Without a son, he feared for the stability of his kingdom and the Tudor dynasty. His eyes began to wander, settling on the alluring Anne Boleyn. Suddenly, the papal dispensation that had allowed him to marry Catherine became a problem in his mind. He convinced himself that the marriage was cursed against God's law, because Catherine had indeed consummated her marriage to Arthur. This newfound conviction was incredibly convenient, as it would allow him to cast Catherine aside and marry Anne. Henry sent his trusted minister, Cardinal Wolsey, to Rome to secure an annulment from Pope Clement VII. The Pope, however, was in an impossible position. He was at that very moment a virtual prisoner of Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, whose armies had sacked Rome in 1527. Granting an annulment that would disgrace his powerful kinswoman was simply not an option for Clement VII. He stalled, he procrastinated. He sent legates to England to hold prolonged tribunals. Catherine, for her part, was not silent. She appeared before the legates, eloquent and dignified, insisting on the validity of her marriage, asserting her virtue, and appealing directly to Rome. Reference: State Papers, 1529. Her defiance wasn't a dramatic sword-wielding stand, but a deeply personal, unshakable conviction rooted in her faith and honor. She held that her first marriage was unconsummated, that her marriage to Henry was therefore lawful in God's eyes, and that the Pope had the authority to grant the dispensation which he had. To deny it now was to deny her own integrity and the legitimacy of her daughter. Mary Catherine refused to be silent. She wrote passionate letters to the Pope, pleading her case and imploring him to resist Henry's pressure. Source: Catherine of Aragon's Letters, 1529. She used every legal and diplomatic avenue available to her. Relying on her deep legal knowledge and the advice of loyal counselors, as Henry's frustration mounted, his patience with Rome wore thin. In 1532, he pushed through parliamentary acts that began to dismantle the Pope's authority in England. In 1533, without a papal annulment, Henry married Anne Boleyn. Catherine was exiled from court, separated from her daughter, and stripped of her title as queen, instead being referred to as the Dowager Princess of Wales. This was meant to break her, to force her to submit. But Catherine's resolve never wavered. She continued to insist she was Henry's true wife and queen, signing her letters, Catherine the Queen. Reference: Royal Correspondence, 1534. She refused to acknowledge the new Acts of Parliament or the authority of the English church courts to annul her marriage. She defied the king's explicit orders to relinquish her titles and her daughter's legitimacy. Her steadfastness was an ongoing challenge not just to Henry, but also to the very notion that a king, or even a pope, could arbitrarily dissolve a marriage and a queen's identity. Pope Clement VII finally issued a ruling in 1534 declaring Henry's marriage to Catherine valid, and his subsequent marriage to Anne invalid. But by then, Henry had already severed ties with Rome, establishing the Church of England with himself at its head. Catherine lived in isolated estates for the remaining years of her life, refusing to accept the new reality. She died in 1536, still asserting her status as queen, still defying the annulment, still believing in the sacrament of her marriage. Her life was a testament to the power of personal conviction, even against the combined might of a king and the political pressures on a pope. She lived to tell her story through her unwavering stance, her legacy cemented as a queen who refused to yield her truth. Number 2. Joanna I of Naples. The year is 1345 and the bustling city of Naples is reeling from scandal. Andrew, Duke of Calabria and husband of Queen Joanna I, has been brutally murdered, strangled, and thrown from a window. Fingers point immediately to Joanna, who was just 19 years old. This isn't just a local affair. Andrew was a prince of Hungary, and his brother King Louis I of Hungary is already vowing vengeance. But more importantly, Naples is a papal fief, meaning its rulers owe allegiance to the Pope. And the Pope, Clement VI, is about to become deeply involved in one of the most sensational royal murder mysteries of the medieval age. Joanna, born in 1326, inherited the kingdom of Naples and Provence at just 16. A precarious position for a young woman in a turbulent world. Her first marriage to Andrew, arranged to unite two branches of the Angevin dynasty, was famously unhappy. Andrew was uncouth and unpopular with the Neapolitan nobility, who resented his Hungarian retinue and his demands for more power. After his death, suspicion fell heavily on Joanna. The Pope, Clement VI, was in Avignon, not Rome. A sign of the complex political landscape of the time, the Avignon papacy. He was not just the spiritual head of the church, he was a temporal lord with a direct feudal claim over Naples. The murder of Andrew was an affront to papal authority, and a challenge to the stability of a key papal dependency. Clement VI immediately demanded an investigation. Joanna, however, was no pushover. She refused to simply submit to papal judgment or to her vengeful brother-in-law. She acted swiftly, arresting several suspects, but the general public and King Louis of Hungary were not convinced of her innocence. Louis, fueled by grief and ambition, invaded Naples in 1347, seeking to depose Joanna and avenge his brother's death. This was a direct challenge to Joanna's rule, but also an indirect challenge to the Pope's feudal authority over Naples. Joanna, facing an invading army, took a bold step. She fled Naples, seeking refuge in her other domain, Provence. Important, Provence was near Avignon, where Pope Clement VI resided. This was a strategic move. She knew she could not fight Louis alone, but she also knew the Pope held the ultimate feudal authority over her kingdom. She needed the Pope to intervene, but on her terms. Upon reaching Avignon, Joanna made a calculated and audacious move. She sold her rights to the city of Avignon to the Pope for 80,000 gold florins. Reference: Histoire de Languedoc, 1348. This act was multi-Languedoc. Gave the Pope undisputed ownership of Avignon, solidifying his residence there. But more importantly, it was a symbolic payment for her own trial, a plea for justice, and a way to secure the Pope's favor. Clement VI, eager to secure Avignon and perhaps seeing an opportunity to assert his authority, agreed to hear her case personally. Before a papal consistory, the highest court of the Church, Joanna defended herself with eloquence and skill. She denied any involvement in her husband's murder. Though the evidence against her was circumstantial and highly politicized, the Pope was swayed. In 1348, Clement VI formally absolved Joanna of any guilt in Andrew's murder, declaring her innocent. This was a remarkable victory for a young queen, particularly one accused of such a heinous crime. She had gone directly to the Pope, faced his judgment, and walked away free. She had defied the widespread accusations and the powerful Hungarian king who had invaded her lands, but her defiance didn't end there. Louis of Hungary still occupied Naples, and his forces resisted her return. Joanna, with papal backing, began a long and arduous campaign to reclaim her kingdom. She ruled from Provence, raising armies and negotiating, demonstrating remarkable resilience and political acumen. Pope, while having cleared her name, continued to exert his feudal influence over Naples, often sending legates and intervening in succession disputes. Joanna, however, constantly asserted her independence, pushing back against overreach. Her reign was marked by further defiance against papal authority. During the Western Schism, which saw 2 and later 3 popes vying for legitimacy, Joanna made a critical choice. In 1378, when Pope Urban VI, recognized by Rome, proved autocratic and difficult, Joanna decided to support the Avignon Pope, Clement VII, who was recognized by France and other kingdoms. Source: Villani's Chronicle, 1378. This was a direct act of defiance against Urban VI, the Pope in Rome. Urban VI retaliated swiftly, excommunicating Joanna and declaring her deposed from her kingdom. He even authorized a new claimant, Charles of Durazzo, to invade Naples and seize her throne. This papal sentence was a direct challenge to Joanna's legitimacy and her very life. But Joanna again refused to yield. She fought back, using diplomacy and military force. She held onto her throne for years, despite the papal excommunication and the ongoing war with Charles of Durazzo. She raised armies, secured alliances, and continued to rule, showing extraordinary courage and resilience in the face of immense pressure. Ultimately, Joanna I was captured and murdered in 1382 by Charles of Durazzo, who had seized her kingdom with the backing of Pope Urban VI. However, she had defied a papal excommunication and an invasion for over 4 years, maintaining her queenly dignity and refusing to relinquish her claim. Her life was a tempest of political intrigue, accusations, and open warfare, but she consistently stood her ground, challenging both secular and ecclesiastical powers, proving that a queen could indeed defy the Pope and dictate her own fate for a significant period. She truly lived to tell through her actions a story of remarkable perseverance against papal censure and royal ambition. Number 3. Margaret of Denmark. The year's 1397, and the towering figure of Margaret, Valdemar's daughter, Queen of Denmark, Norway, and eventually Sweden, stands at the pinnacle of Scandinavian power. She has just orchestrated the Kalmar Union, bringing 3 separate kingdoms under a single crown. An unprecedented achievement. But uniting kingdoms is one thing. Controlling them along with the powerful church within them is another. Margaret was a master of political maneuvering, and her reign was marked by a constant assertion of royal power, often at the expense of ecclesiastical authority, including the distant but still influential Pope. Born in 1353, Margaret's life was a grand tapestry, woven with ambition and shrewd diplomacy. She was the daughter of King Valdemar, the 4th of Denmark, and married to King Håkon, the 6th of Norway and Sweden. Her son, Olaf, inherited both Denmark and Norway. When Olaf died young in 1387, Margaret, through sheer force of will and political skill, secured her position as regent. She eventually brought Sweden under her control, as well creating a vast Scandinavian empire under her adopted son, Eric of Pomerania. The medieval church was immensely powerful, owning vast lands, collecting tithes, and exercising significant legal jurisdiction. In Scandinavia, as elsewhere, bishops and abbots often acted as powerful feudal lords, sometimes even vying for power with secular rulers. The Pope, through his legates and pronouncements, held ultimate authority over the church, including the power to appoint bishops, collect revenues, and issue spiritual decrees that could impact secular rule. Margaret understood that to truly unify and strengthen her union, she needed control over all aspects of her realms, including the church. Her defiance of papal authority was not usually a dramatic excommunication or a direct theological challenge. Instead, it was a systematic, pragmatic assertion of royal power over the church's temporal affairs, a steady chipping away at papal and local ecclesiastical independence. One key area of conflict was the appointment of bishops and other high-ranking clergy. Traditionally, the Pope held the right to appoint bishops, but local rulers often tried to influence these decisions. Margaret took this a step further. She actively intervened in the election of bishops, promoting her own loyal candidates, often ignoring or delaying papal bulls' decrees that named other individuals. Source: Danish Royal Charters, 1400 to 1410. She understood that bishops were not just spiritual leaders, but also powerful administrators and landowners who could either support or undermine her authority. By ensuring loyal churchmen filled these positions, she extended her reach throughout the realms. Another major point of contention was church wealth. The church held immense lands and collected significant revenues, much of which traditionally went to Rome or local clergy. Margaret, in dire need of funds to administer her vast union, repeatedly imposed taxes on church property and demanded contributions from clergy. Reference: Norwegian Archives, 1405. These levies were often met with resistance from the local clergy, who appealed to the Pope, arguing that their wealth was immune from secular taxation. Margaret, however, persisted, viewing these funds as essential for the stability and defense of her realms. She would often justify her actions by claiming the money was for the common good, or for defense against pirates, which the church itself had an interest in. Source: Swedish Ecclesiastical Records, 1408. When papal legates arrived to protest her actions, Margaret was diplomatic but firm. She would acknowledge the Pope's spiritual authority, but argue that practical matters of governance and defense required her to act as she saw fit within her own kingdoms. She was a master of calculated ambiguity, acknowledging the Pope's theoretical rights while actively undermining them in practice. She knew that the vast distance between Scandinavia and Rome, combined with the ongoing Western Schism, where multiple popes claimed legitimacy, intervened in her affairs. She used the schism to her advantage, sometimes playing one pope against another, or simply delaying her response to papal demands. Margaret also asserted her legal authority over the church. She insisted that royal courts, not just ecclesiastical courts, had jurisdiction over certain cases involving clergy or church property, especially those that touched upon royal rights or public order. This was a direct challenge to the Church's long-standing claim of judicial independence. Reference: Kalmar Union Documents, 1402. She also regulated the number of monasteries and attempted to curb the acquisition of land by the Church. Recognizing that uncontrolled church growth could diminish royal power, her reign, which spanned over 30 years, saw her consolidate an empire by asserting royal power over the Church with remarkable success. She never faced excommunication for her actions, nor did she engage in open warfare with the papacy. Her defiance was more akin to a steady strategic advance, a constant pressure that gradually redefined the relationship between crown and mitre in Scandinavia. She skillfully navigated the political landscape, ensuring that the Church served the interests of the crown rather than operating as an independent power within her realms. Margaret died in 1412, having built a stable and powerful union. She lived to tell a story of a queen who defied papal influence, not with direct confrontation, but with relentless administrative and political pressure, effectively ensuring that in her vast empire it was the Queen, not the Pope, who held ultimate sway. Number 4. Hermesenda of Carason. Let us travel back to the dawn of the second millennium, to the sun-drenched lands of Catalonia, where in the early 11th century a woman named Hermesenda of Carason would reign with an iron will, facing down powerful counts, rebellious nobles, and crucially, the growing influence of the Church and even the Pope. Her story is one of unprecedented female rule and fierce defiance. Born around 972, Hermesenda was the daughter of Count Roger I of Carason. In 992, she married Count Ramon Borrell of Barcelona, becoming Countess of Barcelona, Girona, and Osona, a powerful domain in the emerging Christian states of the Iberian Peninsula. When her husband died in 1017, her son Berenguer Ramon I was still a minor. Hermesenda, with her formidable intelligence and political acumen, immediately stepped into the role of regent. This was common for aristocratic women, but Hermesenda did not relinquish power when her son came of age. Instead, she continued to co-rule a situation that lasted for decades and was almost unheard of for a woman of her time. Her son, while officially count, was often indecisive and less interested in governing. Hermesenda effectively held the reins of power, issuing charters, presiding over courts, and leading armies. She was a true ruler in her own right. However, her authority was constantly challenged, not just by ambitious vassals and external enemies, but increasingly by the Church. In the 11th century, the Church in Europe was undergoing a period of reform known as the Gregorian Reform, which sought to centralize papal power, curb secular interference in church affairs, and establish moral authority. This meant popes and their local representatives. The bishops were becoming more assertive, demanding independence from lay rulers and control over church property and appointments. This brought them into direct conflict with powerful rulers like Hermesenda, who saw their traditional rights being eroded. Hermesenda's defiance against the Church manifested in several ways. She insisted on maintaining the count's traditional rights over ecclesiastical appointments and properties within her domains. Bishops in Catalonia, like Bishop Oliba of Vic, a prominent monastic reformer, often championed the Gregorian ideals and sought to establish the Church's independence from secular rulers. Hermesenda repeatedly clashed with these powerful churchmen over jurisdiction, land, and allegiance. She saw the Church as part of her realm, subject to her authority, rather than an independent entity. One of the most significant confrontations came when Hermesenda began to exercise stricter control over judicial matters. The Church argued that clergy and church lands were subject only to ecclesiastical law and courts. Hermesenda, however, insisted on the supremacy of the Count's court in her territories, particularly in cases involving peace and truce agreements, which were vital for maintaining order in a turbulent society. Source: Barcelona Cathedral Archives, 1020s. She saw these as fundamental aspects of her temporal power which the Church was attempting to usurp. Her defiance reached a critical point during the pontificate of Pope Benedict VIII, 1012 to 1024, and later Pope John XIX, 1024 to 1032. Hermesenda, despite being a pious Christian and a patron of monasteries, did not hesitate to challenge papal pronouncements when they infringed upon her perceived rights. She was known to be a fierce defender of her family's patrimony and political prerogatives. When local bishops appealed to Rome, Hermesenda often ignored papal directives or used her influence to delay their enforcement. She was even threatened with excommunication for her steadfast refusal to yield on issues of power and jurisdiction. There are indications that at one point she might have actually faced excommunication for her defiance of ecclesiastical authority. Reference: Annals of Joanna, early 11th century. To be excommunicated meant spiritual damnation and potentially political isolation, as subjects might be released from their oaths of loyalty. For a ruler in the Middle Ages, this was a terrifying prospect. But Hermesenda, with her immense political strength and the loyalty of her people and many nobles, weathered these storms. She continued to rule effectively even after her son Berengar Ramon I died in 1035 and her grandson Ramon Berengar I took the throne. She continued to act as a co-ruler, issuing important documents and influencing policy well into her 80s. Her resilience in the face of papal and ecclesiastical pressure was extraordinary. She maintained her power, refusing to let the church dictate the terms of her rule. Her defiance was not a single dramatic act, but a lifetime of asserting secular authority against a rising tide of papal centralization. She understood that power, once yielded, was hard to reclaim. She lived to be around 90 years old, dying in 1058, having ruled for over 4 decades, outliving her husband, her son, and even outmaneuvering several popes and numerous bishops. Hermesenda of Carason stands as a testament to a queen's ability to not only survive, but thrive by fiercely defending her sovereignty against the most powerful spiritual force in Europe. Number 5. Empress Matilda. The year is 1135. King Henry I of England has died. His only legitimate son drowned years earlier, leaving his daughter Matilda as his chosen heir. Henry had made his barons swear an oath to accept Matilda as their queen, but the moment his eyes closed, the oath was broken. Her cousin Stephen of Blois seized the throne, plunging England into a brutal civil war known as the Anarchy. For nearly 2 decades, Matilda, a woman of formidable will and imperial title, fought to reclaim her birthright, often facing down not just armies, but also the formidable influence of the Pope and the Church. Matilda's life began in privilege. Born in 1102, she was the daughter of Henry I, King of England and Duke of Normandy. At the tender age of 8, she was sent to Germany to marry Emperor Henry V of the Holy Roman Empire, becoming Empress. This grand title brought her immense prestige and a deep understanding of European high politics. When her imperial husband died in 1125, she returned to England only to be declared heir by her father. Her second marriage to Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou, was politically astute, but personally, the Church played a huge role in medieval politics, especially in matters of succession. Popes and their legates often acted as arbiters, counselors, and sometimes powerful partisans. Pope Innocent II, at the outset of the Anarchy, and later Eugenius III, held significant sway. Whoever the Pope backed could gain immense legitimacy, while those he condemned faced a perilous struggle. From the moment Stephen seized the throne, the Church became a critical player. Stephen quickly secured the support of some English bishops and even the recognition of Pope Innocent II. This papal recognition was a huge blow to Matilda's claim. It implied that Stephen's seizure of the crown, despite the oaths made to Matilda, was legitimate in the eyes of God and the Church. But Matilda was not one to back down. She had been designated heir by her father, and she viewed Stephen as a usurper. Her defiance was not directed at the Pope's spiritual authority itself, but at the Pope's political decision to back Stephen. She considered this a grave injustice and an interference in what she believed was her divine right to rule. She launched a fierce campaign, gathering support from her half-brother Robert of Gloucester and Scottish King David I. Her fight against Stephen was relentless, a bloody back and forth that devastated England. When papal legates arrived in England during the conflict ostensibly to broker peace or to assert church rights, Matilda was always careful in her dealings, but she never compromised on her claim to the throne. She understood that while the Pope might recognize Stephen, her own legitimacy stemmed from her father's will and her royal blood. She defied the implied papal endorsement of Stephen simply by continuing her fight, by refusing to yield. In 1141, Matilda achieved a stunning victory. Her forces captured Stephen, and for a brief period she held London and was poised to be crowned queen. Her supporters, including the powerful Henry of Blois, Bishop of Winchester and Stephen's brother, initially seemed to accept her. This was a moment where papal recognition of Stephen seemed to crumble. However, Matilda's arrogant style and failure to win over the Londoners led to a swift reversal. She was driven out, and Stephen was soon released. The war continued. Throughout this period, the Pope and his legates continued to try to influence the outcome. They issued decrees, held councils, and excommunicated various supporters of both sides in an attempt to bring order or to further their own interests. Matilda consistently refused to accept any settlement that did not acknowledge her as the rightful heir. She stubbornly held to her right to rule, despite the Pope's initial and often ongoing, albeit wavering, recognition of Stephen. Her sheer persistence in the face of papal preference for a male ruler was a quiet yet profound defiance. She was effectively saying, "My right is from God and my Father, not from your political maneuvering." She never achieved sole, undisputed rule as queen, but her resilience paid off in another way. After years of brutal warfare, the tide turned towards her son, Henry Plantagenet, the future Henry II. She had groomed him for the throne, ensuring he was educated and militarily capable. In 1153, Stephen, exhausted and defeated, agreed to the Treaty of Winchester, recognizing Matilda's son Henry as his heir. When Stephen died the following year, Henry ascended the throne, securing the Plantagenet dynasty. Matilda, though never formally crowned Queen of England, had fought for nearly 2 decades against the most powerful man in Europe and a rival king. She lived to see her son rule, a living testament to her unwavering determination. She had defied papal support for Stephen, endured excommunications of her allies, and persisted through nearly 2 decades of civil war. Her survival and her ultimate success in securing the throne for her lineage were a direct outcome of her refusal to accept the Church's initial verdict or any other outcome short of her family's rightful claim. She lived to tell the story of a queen who never gave up her crown, even when the spiritual power of Rome seemed to be against her. Number 6. Oraka of Castile. Let's turn our gaze to the Iberian Peninsula in the early 12th century, to a kingdom fractured by ambition and entangled in the complex web of church politics. Here, Queen Oraka of Castile, born in 1081, would ascend to the throne in 1109, becoming the first reigning queen of Spain. Her reign was a tempest of conflict marked by civil wars, rebellions, and an incredibly dramatic, highly controversial marriage that brought her into direct fiery confrontation with the Pope himself. Oraka inherited her father, King Alfonso VI's vast but often unstable kingdom. Alfonso VI had unified Leon and Castile and pushed back against the Muslim Taifas in the south. However, his death left a void, and Oraka, a woman in a deeply patriarchal society, was immediately challenged. To secure her position and unite the Christian kingdoms, her father had arranged her marriage to Alfonso, the first king of Aragon in Navarre. This was meant to be a grand political union, creating an even more powerful Spanish state, but from the outset the marriage was a disaster. Oraka and Alfonso I, both strong-willed rulers, clashed constantly. Their union was marked by bitter personal animosity and open warfare between their respective forces. Oraka fought fiercely to maintain her independence and the autonomy of her kingdoms, resisting Alfonso's attempts to control her. This personal and political struggle quickly escalated, drawing in the church. The problem, they were first cousins. While the church allowed for marriages between cousins with a papal dispensation, the relationship between Oraka and Alfonso I was considered too close by some ecclesiastical standards. Furthermore, their continuous warfare and the resulting instability within the Christian kingdoms were a major concern for the Pope. Pope Paschal II, and later Pope Calixtus II, saw the marriage as scandalous and a threat to the efforts of the Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of Spain from the Muslims. The Pope wanted unity among the Christian rulers, not perpetual warfare between them. The local clergy, particularly Archbishop Bernard of Toledo, also championed the annulment, citing the degree of kinship and the constant conflict as reasons. Source: Chronica Latine, Regum Castili, 1110. In 1114, Pope Paschal II issued a bull, a papal decree declaring the marriage of Oraka and Alfonso I null and void due to their consanguinity, blood relationship, and the resulting chaos. Reference: Papal Bulls, 1114. This was a direct command from the spiritual head of Christendom. For most medieval rulers, a papal annulment was binding, meant any children born of the union would be illegitimate, and the parties were free to remarry. But Oraka defied the Pope's decree. She refused to acknowledge the annulment, at least initially. Despite the papal pronouncement, she continued to act as if she were still married to Alfonso for a period, attempting to use the union for political advantage, even while fighting him. Her defiance was rooted in a practical political need to maintain her position and resist the pressures from various factions who wanted to depose her or carve up her kingdom. She needed the perceived unity the marriage offered. Even if it was a fiction, her resistance to the papal annulment was audacious. She did not openly denounce the Pope, but rather strategically ignored or delayed compliance, navigating the complex political landscape. She understood that if the annulment was widely accepted, it could weaken her claim to the throne, as her legitimacy could be tied to the validity of her marriage. Her defiance was a calculated risk to preserve her power. Throughout her reign, Oraka also asserted royal authority over the church within her domains. She clashed with bishops and archbishops over land, jurisdiction, and rights, often ignoring ecclesiastical privileges when they conflicted with her royal prerogatives. She appointed her own favored individuals to clerical positions, a practice that directly challenged the church's growing claim to independence in appointments. She was not afraid to remove bishops who opposed her or to seize church property when she felt it necessary for her kingdom. Oraka faced relentless pressure from her estranged husband, from various factions of nobles, and from the powerful church. Despite having her marriage declared invalid by the Pope, she continued to rule. She fought several civil wars, often personally leading her troops into battle. She maintained her position against incredible odds, proving that a determined queen could defy even the highest spiritual authority. And survive, she died in 1126, having ruled for 17 tumultuous years. Her son, from her first politically acceptable marriage, Alfonso VII, succeeded her. Oraka had lived to tell a story of a queen who defied papal decrees on marriage, asserted her own political power, and navigated a dangerous world as the sole reigning monarch. Her reign is a testament to her fierce independence and her ability to withstand intense pressure from all sides, including the Pope himself. Number 7. Blanch of Castile. Imagine the early 13th century, a time of crusades, burgeoning universities, and deeply entrenched papal authority. Now, picture a queen regent, not just governing a kingdom, but effectively managing a very powerful French church, often pushing back against papal interference. This was Blanch of Castile, born in 1188, a formidable queen whose regency for her young son, Louis IX, was marked by unwavering defense of royal power, even against the pronouncements of popes and their assertive legates. Blanche was a grandchild of the legendary Eleanor of Aquitane. Inheriting her grandmother's intelligence and political acumen, she married Louis VIII of France in 1200. When Louis VIII died in 1226, their son Louis IX was only 12 years old. Blanche immediately took up the regency, a position that placed her at the heart of French politics and, crucially, its relationship with Rome. The Capetian kings of France had a long history of a complex relationship with the papacy. While generally devout and supportive of the Church, they also fiercely defended the rights of the French crown over its own territories and institutions. Blanche continued this tradition with extraordinary vigor. One of her earliest and most significant challenges came from the French nobility, who saw the young king's minority as an opportunity to regain lost power. Blanche skillfully put down numerous rebellions, often leading her own troops and negotiating astute treaties. But she also faced challenges from within the Church. The papacy, particularly under Pope Gregory IX, 1227 to 1241, was at its peak of power. Popes were asserting their authority over secular rulers, demanding greater independence for the clergy, and intervening in local church affairs. Gregory IX was a strong pope who launched crusades and clashed frequently with the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. When his legates arrived in France, they expected to be obeyed. Blanche, however, was not easily swayed. Her defiance was not about theology, but about the practicalities of governance and the assertion of royal rights. She insisted on the crown's authority over the French Church, particularly in matters of jurisdiction and taxation. For instance, the Church in France often claimed clerical immunity, meaning clergy were exempt from royal taxes and were subject only to ecclesiastical courts. Blanche, in need of funds for her government and to suppress rebellions, often levied taxes on church property. When the clergy protested and appealed to the Pope, Blanche held firm, arguing that the Church, like any other institution in the kingdom, had a responsibility to contribute to the common good and the defense of the realm. Source: Royal Accounts of France, 1230s. She knew that the Pope needed French support for his own political goals, and she used this leverage. Another key area of conflict was the jurisdiction of royal courts versus ecclesiastical courts. The Church's courts claimed jurisdiction over a wide range of cases, including marriage, wills, and even certain criminal matters involving clergy or church property. Blanche, however, insisted that serious crimes committed by clergy, especially those that disturbed the king's peace, should be tried in royal courts. She also limited appeals from French ecclesiastical courts to Rome, asserting that royal justice was sufficient and that constant appeals undermined French sovereignty. Reference: French Royal Decrees, 1235. This was a direct challenge to the Pope's judicial authority within France. Papal legates were sent to France to press the Pope's demands and to mediate disputes. Blanche, while outwardly respectful, was always firm in her defense of French royal prerogative. She would meet with legates, listen to their arguments, but often subtly, or not so subtly, resist their demands, ensuring that the king's authority remained supreme. There are accounts of her directly confronting papal legates, insisting that the king's rights superseded their mandates when it came to temporal matters within the kingdom. Source: Jean de Joinville, Life of St. Louis, 1240s. Blanche's tenacity was legendary. She refused to be intimidated by the threat of interdict, a papal punishment that would suspend religious services in a region, or excommunication, which were potent weapons for the Pope. She navigated these challenges with incredible political skill, ensuring that France remained a powerful Catholic kingdom while simultaneously asserting its independence from excessive papal control. She understood that a strong monarchy required control over all institutions within its borders, including the Church. She governed France with remarkable success, putting down internal revolts, repelling English invasions, and securing the kingdom for her son. She raised Louis IX to be a pious but strong ruler who continued his mother's policy of asserting royal authority over the French Church. She died in 1252, having cemented her legacy as one of France's most effective rulers. Blanch of Castile lived to tell a story of a queen who, through sheer force of will and political genius, defied papal overreach, ensuring that the French crown, and not the Pope, held the ultimate temporal authority within its borders. Number 8. Eleanor of Aquitane. Let's journey to the heart of the 12th century, to a time when chivalry and crusades dominated the European imagination, and when the power of the Pope was immense. In this vibrant and turbulent era, one woman stood head and shoulders above the rest: Eleanor of Aquitaine. Born in 1122, Duchess of Aquitaine and her own right Queen of France, and later Queen of England, Eleanor was a political force of nature. Her life was a saga of ambition, rebellion, and defiance, including her legendary clashes with the highest authority in Christendom, the Pope. Eleanor was no ordinary medieval noblewoman. She inherited the vast, wealthy, and culturally sophisticated Duchy of Aquitaine, making her one of the most desirable heiresses in Europe. Her first marriage in 1137 was to Louis VII, the King of France. Their union was often strained, partly due to personality clashes, and partly due to Eleanor's powerful, independent spirit. She accompanied Louis on the Second Crusade, where her presence and actions were widely discussed, often controversially. The relationship between a king and queen, and indeed the validity of their marriage, was a matter of profound importance to the Church. Marriages were sacraments, and annulments were rare and complex, requiring papal approval. Eleanor and Louis had 2 daughters but no sons, which created a dynastic problem for France. More critically, their personalities and goals were incompatible. Louis was pious and often indecisive. Eleanor was worldly, politically shrewd, and fiercely independent. By 1152, both Eleanor and Louis wanted an end to their marriage. The official reason for an annulment was typically consanguinity, that the couple was related within prohibited degrees by blood. While Eleanor and Louis were indeed related, the degree was often overlooked for political marriages. Pope Eugene III had previously tried to reconcile them. However, in March 1152, a church council at Beaugency, presided over by papal legates, finally granted the annulment. The official reason given was their close blood relationship. Source: Historia Pontificalis, 1152. This annulment was a delicate act of defiance on Eleanor's part. While both parties desired it, Eleanor was determined to retain her vast lands, Aquitaine. She did not want to lose her power and status by simply being cast aside. By agreeing to an annulment based on consanguinity, rather than say an accusation of infidelity, she protected her reputation and, crucially, her right to her duchy. This was a direct manipulation of the Church's rules to serve her own political ends, but her defiance of the Pope wasn't a single act. It was embedded in her very being as a powerful female ruler. Just 2 months after her annulment from Louis, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. Henry was Louis's rival, and a man over a decade younger than Eleanor. Their marriage was another strategic move. It also happened very quickly, some might say too quickly, after her annulment, further challenging the norms of the time. The speed of the marriage, and the fact that Henry was also related to Eleanor within prohibited degrees, suggests that both Eleanor and Henry were prepared to defy, or at least circumvent, papal authority for their political ambitions. They sought no new dispensation, or if they did, it was granted with unprecedented speed. Reference: Gervase of Canterbury, 1152. Within 2 years, Henry became King Henry II of England, making Eleanor Queen of England. She now held immense power, ruling vast territories from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Her reign as Queen of England was often turbulent, particularly as she supported her sons in their various rebellions against their father, Henry II. These rebellions often drew in church figures who were torn between supporting royal authority and promoting peace. Eleanor's defiance against papal authority often manifested in more subtle ways through her assertion of secular power over ecclesiastical matters within her domains. She presided over a sophisticated court in Poitiers, acting as a true sovereign. She would appoint her own men to church positions, intervene in monastic affairs, and generally assert royal control over the church's temporal holdings, which was often a point of tension with bishops and popes who sought to assert church independence. Source: Aquitane Charters, 1170s. Her most direct confrontation with the Pope came indirectly through her support for her son's rebellions against Henry II. When Henry II, furious at Eleanor's involvement, imprisoned her in 1173, she spent 16 years as a royal prisoner. During this long imprisonment, various popes, Alexander III and Lucius III, and archbishops of Canterbury intervened, often urging Henry II to release her, citing her royal status and the injustice of her confinement. These appeals from the Church were in a way a recognition of her enduring legitimacy and power, even in captivity. Henry II, however, largely ignored these papal requests, demonstrating his own defiance, but also Eleanor's unwavering status in the eyes of the Church, despite her own history of challenging its marital rules. Upon Henry II's death in 1189, Eleanor was immediately released by her son Richard the Lionheart, who became king. She then effectively governed England and Aquitaine during Richard's long absence on crusade and during his imprisonment. In this period, she held immense power, making decisions that directly affected the Church. She dealt with papal legates, negotiated church appointments, and asserted her authority, demonstrating that even after years of imprisonment, her political will remained unbroken. Eleanor of Aquitaine died in 1204, having outlived 2 husbands and most of her children. Her life was a masterclass in political survival and the assertion of female power. She had defied papal pronouncements on her marriage, strategically navigated the Church's influence to secure her own power, and consistently asserted her authority over both secular and ecclesiastical affairs. Throughout her incredibly long and influential life, she truly lived to tell a tale of a queen who carved her own path, even when it meant challenging the Pope himself.